Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the organizers for making it possible to have such a big conference. I would also like to say that I'm very, very excited about this session and to hear back from the workshops, because we have heard yesterday already that the different country contexts are extremely complex and extremely diverse. And now during these workshops, people have been looked into how 1325 applies to their specific local context. And in view of the limited time we have, I will stop right now, right here, and ask Binet Deschella from the Afghanistan Workshop to present their results and outcomes of their discussions.
Thank you very much. I was lucky to be in the Afghanistan workshop with Dr. Soraya Sobrang and with Camila Faiziar, which you find here in the first row. And we would have loved to share their findings and their insights with so many of you. So I'll give you the short version. Later on, I'm sure you can pick up all these things also with those two. We, of course, in the Afghan context, found... What is it?
That is for your PowerPoint presentation.
I don't have a PowerPoint presentation.
There is one. There is one between.
Oh, that's interesting. Well.
Okay, then we leave it like that.
It's coming directly out of your hand.
Well, I mean,
Magic.
There are miracles happening here, since I'm not familiar with this PowerPoint presentation and I have no idea where it came from. I'm not sure how to use it and whether it will be useful.
Well, maybe we can leave it as a background information,
Yes.
and you just go ahead.
We
with
leave
your...
it. So, I mean, we were, of course, following the central questions that we had discussed before also, and that Gitti wonderfully has also put here. And, I mean, in the question of obstacles, we identified mainly 3 obstacles in Afghanistan. One is that the government is weak and that it is not able is to implement all the very well-adopted laws it already has. I mean, Afghanistan has become a member or a signatory of 1325. Afghanistan is also a member of CEDAW. Last year, a law for the elimination of violence against women was passed. There are gender mainstreaming departments in important ministries, as well as a ministry of its own for women's affairs. All of them technically are, of course, part of what was intended with 1325, but I mean, both our guests stress that in practice these are things that are not well reflected in daily routine and in the daily life of people in Afghanistan. So the weakness of the government, and on the other hand, of course, also the strength of the Taliban, but as a third factor that is mainly overlooked here, the strength of conservatism in people's minds are major obstacles to a successful implementation of Resolution 1325 in Afghanistan. Of course, with the heavy external influence in Afghanistan, things that are happening there are not entirely in the hands of the Afghan government or the society there. Therefore, one aspect that also was mentioned several times, and rightfully so, was the international community's role, that there are verbal commitments to women's rights, there are verbal commitments to the protection of civilians in this very difficult and everyday more insecure situation. But when it comes to points in which we would push, or in which there would be a need for pushing more for women's inclusion in processes, political processes as well as societal processes, this is not really happening in Afghanistan. So we looked into what should be done, and of course it was stressed that international community should become more consistent in asking for protection of civilians and in asking for the implementation of women's rights. There are occasions for this whenever there are international conferences on the future of Afghanistan, and it was pointed out that in the London conference, international community had not really been an advocate of inclusion of women or of civil society for that matter. We saw the same in Kabul conference, and currently, of course, the issue of the High Council for Peace, the institution in Afghanistan that is being set up for negotiations with the Taliban, and of course, evidently a topic that is very closely related to the future of human rights in Afghanistan and to the future of women's rights. We see only 7 women in this 70 members council, and of these 7, only 1 really has the support of civil society. The other ones have been appointed by the government to be more in favor of the government, and as Soraya pointed out, they are not standing for women's rights, they're rather standing for men's rights. So this council will, I think, be the future interest that we should all look at, and where I think international community should not fail in lobbying for women's interests being represented through that council. And we also asked everybody who was in this discussion what could be done in terms of international exchange. There we had the very good input of somebody who mentioned that in Somalia and in Malaysia we might have a similar situation of a very determined exclusion of women, where women come together and develop their additional channels somehow, where they set up interest groups that particularly then lobby for women's interests. Of course, this is the most exchange-based point. I think what was more important in this round was certainly the international push, the lobbying, the support and the strengthening that should be continued for women in Afghanistan, for women's rights activists, and to lead the country to a more gender-balanced future. Thank you.
Thank you, Bente Schella. That was really insightful, especially when talking about the obstacles and challenges in Afghanistan, considering the peace negotiation as well as the different actors and roles and the future perspective you have elaborated. Now, the next representative from the workshop I would like to call up on, and we will have time for questioning, maybe like very short time for questioning the group or representatives of the workshops later on. Now I would like to go over to Heidi Meinsold from the Israel-Palestine Workshop. And I'm not sure, like, will you present the PowerPoint presentation?
I saw it already before, so it makes a little difference. But you can start also with this first thing, and then we have only 2 pages, which illustrate only what the obstacles and the perspectives for the future. So perhaps if you can, when I come to the obstacles, but okay. Concerning obstacles, we heard already yesterday evening and today a lot of political points which are determining the discussion on women's participation or women's protection, whatever is concerned by the 1325. The main obstacle is the total political asymmetry between Israel and Palestine, which is turning around the occupation story. And story is perhaps not a good word for that. The occupation overwhelming theme, the asymmetry on the level of state or non-state and so-called democracy and whatever. Then one of the main discussion is turning around the word of security. What does mean security? And security is often seen as the circle of violence engendering new violence, and action, reaction, humiliation on the one side, and asking only for security and not considering that this is not automatically peace. Of course, this is also part of this story, is the borders, and which have been decided and are still decided unilaterally. So this is another asymmetry which is blocking not only self-determination, but also, concretely speaking, contacts between Israeli and Palestinian women, civil society, and if the logistic possibility is not there, then also agreements beyond the border are extremely difficult, and it needs much more courageous people to bridge these borders and obstacles. This violent environment is also a big problem. Violence, which is not only the so-called political violence, but goes deep into the society and into domestic violence. This is also a big obstacle, and great problem of poverty and social exclusion, especially for women, is extremely problematic to be bridged by education and meetings and so on. So, but let us go beyond these obstacles, obvious obstacles, and there were a lot of proposals. Can you put the next in? On nevertheless working with and on 1325. One of the main points is promoting the accountability. So this has to be clear. If their law is there, and it's also put into national law or in the law of the Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority. But the problem is that that the focus is not only on national implementation, but if you go beyond international recognition of this law as a UN law, then the countries or the governments could be held accountable for that. Then the question is always linked to poverty and grassroots. In the center of what should be done is education and trainings on all levels, which are really important. And what makes the difference is that if women will be trained, then it's always a complex issue. So we heard examples on how to be successful in trainings. It's not only bringing people together and telling them about the possibilities of Resolution 1325, but having someone keeping the children in between the session, or when the women, or pay them to come somewhere, and all these, which for us might seem logistic problems, but these are fundamental issues to bring people together and to let them participate. A very interesting process is going on the research side, and rewriting history, especially on a feminist perspective. And in Palestine, they discovered a lot of women very much involved in the Palestinian history, but neglected, forgotten, and this project really shows that it's proving that there was a substantial progress in several areas on women. Then yeah, there was a discussion going around who should be, who could and should represent women, and on the one side, growing women's participation in higher position is necessary in order to have them listed up for negotiation participation and so on. But how to get them there if you start from the grassroots level is really something to be developed. And then concerning the elites, elites, yeah, the idea was to have them as promoters for change, but that the communication to the grassroots level is extremely important. Last point, linking 1325 to CEDAW and MDGs. I think this is also a really important issue for, especially for women, and I think that's all.
Thank you very much, Heidi Meinzold, for this very comprehensive outline of the workshop's discussion. I think one of the new or particular messages that can also be taken out of your presentation is that not only the capacity building in terms of a presentation is important, but especially in a context such as Palestine, where we learned that the simple logistics and getting to a place is one as a particular issue as in many other conflict countries, as well as putting a gender component to logistics in simple, like that make it possible for women to attend in like childcare, in having the transport and secure transport guaranteed. Of course, you raised a lot of other issues as well. Now I would like to call for Sibylle Feser to represent the Liberia Workshop. When I came in, I had a little look into all workshops and trying to get a snapshot. So I came into the Liberia Workshop, and a very dynamic exercise was practiced with singing, and I was remembering that in Liberia, that's a very exciting way to express 1325 about the women's movement. So oh, sorry, excuse me. So I'm very excited to hear from Liberia as well.
Okay, so just
would you need the PowerPoint?
No, I don't need it, because I will kind of summarize, and I understood the PowerPoint will also be part of the documentation of the whole event on the website, hopefully in the future. So yeah. There you will find all details, and just to add to what you were saying, of course we did not just dance and sing in the workshop, but there were a lot of really experience gathered, and we had intense group discussions, and I will just as I said, not tackle everything what we discussed, but the main points. So Rebecca, she started with that yesterday already, but today she kind of got a bit deeper into telling us about the obstacles that apart from having really good frameworks in Liberia and having a lot of policies in place and working groups in place, still there are of course obstacles, especially when you work in the area where Rebecca is working, which is in the far southeast, which is kind of 1 to 2 days travel from Monrovia through roads which are in very bad condition. So she really tried to outline what the main obstacles are when it comes to the implementation. So what she said yesterday, or what I just said also is, of course there are general development issues, but of course they are gendered. So the high illiteracy rate of women is one obstacle to really get to understand 1325. And the bad road conditions, which makes it difficult for people to get there to disseminate the information, but also for women to come together to get to know more about it, and in general to access all those services that are part of the indicators in the 1325 action plan in Liberia, to access security, to access the police. The police doesn't reach them because the roads are just so hampered. So that is major obstacles that also fit with what you were saying from Palestine in one way or another. Then, of course, what also Rebecca said yesterday, there are cultural and traditional practices, and we went a bit deeper into secret society issues that I won't now open up here, but I'm sure you can later also ask Rebecca more about it. But also the culture of following the leader, and that women are not in the leading positions in many parts of the country, so they would just agree to what somebody says and won't really give their own opinion. So that is sometimes also very difficult. Then, of course, on a higher level, the funding gaps for the implementation, the monitoring and the evaluation. There is funding available only partly. Then what others already said, also the training that is often inadequately designed for women and girls, and that is not with gendered logistic, as you said. I just said, and in general, the restricted mobility of women, that women have difficulties sometimes. I mean, sometimes they are not allowed to go to meetings because of their husbands not allowing. Sometimes they are just restricted because they are the ones who have the big load of field work on their shoulders, so they can't just leave everything behind. So this is something that also hampers the possibility to get together and start really on grabbing some of the issues highlighted in the 1325 action plan. So then, having heard all those obstacles, we got together and kind of saw what are the main things that should be done, the main strategies that still are important to bridge the gap between the action plan and the implementation. So we saw the main thing is really the breakdown of it. The breakdown of it in many terms, in terms of using, translating key messages or translating key points to local languages, simplifying the often UN-driven or international community-driven indicators, simplifying it, and thinking things to the end, I would say. That was something that was discussed, like, for example, okay, then if you want to spread the message, it's nice to have radio programs, but then you should have them in local languages as well, and you should also ensure that people do have access to radio. So you should also ensure that there are radio listening clubs or groups that gather around the radio to listen and discuss later on, to really be able to digest the information as well, and not just having a one-way information. So that was a major thing, how to break down all those good ideas and fields of action to really go to the very grassroots women. Another big issue that came up in the group works were around networking and exchange, but it was also said that one should look at how to network and how to exchange, that it often doesn't make so much sense only to have one regional network once in a while, people talk and then they go back, but to have a long-term process, like a twinning process, that Sierra Leone and Liberia would sit together and really have a working group which meets regularly over a longer period of time and not just in one meeting. And of course, that this also is something that is often not seen. I mean, there were kind of contradictory experiences. Some were saying donors do give money for the networking. Some say it's rather difficult to get the money for the networkings, but in general that has to be ensured. And for the Liberian context, Rebecca yesterday also said it's important to think really of all what it means, the network meetings, because in Liberia people do complain that there is especially the European donors, they don't see the need for good food in those meetings, and that this is something that when the women come for those meetings, they have to be well fed, and it has to do also with the Liberian hospitality. Then one thing also concerning the networking, which was a very interesting input from Serbian women, was that they do shadow reporting on the 1325 report. So we are just saying there are not even many reports, official reports yet, but there are already shadow reports to it, and that this is something that should be exchanged as well in network meetings, because the shadow reports obviously will also point to where the gaps are, and that this could be a very important tool for networking, regional or even international ones. And along all networking, all meeting and so on, one should really look also on the political education all the way along, and the gender education that should not be missed out. A third big point that was discussed was around the monitoring and evaluation. And one thing what was important and came out of one of the working groups is that it should have a multi-layered strategy. That means really to address what part of the indicators are directed to who, what part of the action plans are directed to who, and then on which level of, for the indicators as well, on which level of, theoretically you need it, or how you have to break down it really to the grassroots. And another group also said more or less the same, saying that the indicators should be broken down to small steps that can be taken in communities, really very basic. How do I address the policeman if he doesn't listen to me? Again, linking to what I said before, the breakdown also of the indicators in the M&E system. Then, of course, the money for the M&E that has to come from the international community as well. And then there were also, of course, the training of local women groups to be able to also be part in the monitoring, not that just some expert groups come once in a while and do the monitoring, but that they are able to monitor their work themselves. And another point, which is of course part of the monitoring system or of the whole setup, is accountability. So that is something that we didn't find yet in examples. So what's been done if the indicators are not met? What happens? What's happening then? And who is pressuring and who is making them accountable? Yeah. The last 2 points that were mentioned is, of course, then what was said is women pressure groups are still needed to make them accountable. So even if we have action plans on 1325, that's rather the beginning than the end. It's something we can work from, but it shouldn't stop there. And in general, that we felt the need for more research and understanding of root causes of violence, or root causes also of issues tackled in 1325, like to really base our solutions and base our project on a more in-depth understanding of the cultural context, of the general context in which we work in. So yeah, that's basically that, and I mean more details you can then get in the PowerPoint presentation later on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think, Liberia as the country represented, having a national action plan adopted, there can be a lot of possibilities for cross-learning experience as already happening. You have mentioned interesting issues such as the access to information, or challenges such as illiteracy, or that the information doesn't get out to everyone in the country. As well as funding, and I think you mentioned the indicators. Liberia has a very ambitious action plan with 190 indicators that are really hard to measure. At the same time, there are gaps of funding. So, and oftentimes in the development process of national action plans, there's a lot of enthusiasm when the document is written and developed. Then there comes the hard part of the implementation, and there comes the even more hard part of funding the resources to monitor and evaluate such a national action plan. So in the case of Liberia, with 190 indicators, that's particularly hard. So as well as Liberia is looking from outside funding to secure this evaluation is done, to ensure that we know what works, what hasn't worked. So I found that really inspiring. But now we change region again, and we move from West Africa to the Caucasus, and I would like to call for Caroline Krukom. Sorry. I would like to ask you as well, would you like the PowerPoint presentation, or do you prefer to not?
I think we can do it as...
We can
for the Liberian case. Let's leave the PowerPoint then for the minutes later on. Yeah, thank you. As it was said already, it's a region where we put our focus on. So that means the South Caucasus is not does not have only one conflict, but a diverse range of different conflicts in this region, which all are interlinked to each other. Therefore, the discussion that we had, of course, is on a rather or more general level than when it comes to summarizing up what are the lessons learned. In our discussion, we very much focused on the broad experiences of the Omnibus 1325, the program that runs in the whole region on grassroots level mainly. And we had a very, very vivid and nice presentation through Marina Grasse and Edgar Khachaturian from Armenia, who explained in what way this omnibus was set in place in the region and was able to link up with different layers of society, mainly with grassroots layers, and open windows or open doors for different styles of dialogue and exchange. And that is a very important element with regard to peace building in this region, to find a way for bottom-up peace building work. The prerequisite of this Omnibus 1325 and the work that the activists are doing there in the region and elsewhere is that they have generated a very broad network of activists in different countries from different contexts, in combination also with activists in Germany and in the Balkan region, and they keep this up. As also an international network to exchange experience and to create dialogue opportunities. And of course, as the name says, the mobility of this mobile academy is one of the prerequisites of this program as well. So our discussion was very much guided by these experiences from that level. Let me come to the two main obstacles which were mentioned in the discussion. The one is as all people had faced violence and war in that region on the one side, and on the other side had experienced the Soviet Union style of life and society. The traumatization is very deep in the society, and the silence to talk about the conflicts and the problems related to the conflicts also on the personal level, but at the same time also then from the experiences from the past to talk about problems on the political level is very, very deep. So traumatization and silence is one of the main obstacles to overcome the silence and to start with successful peace and gender work in all spheres. Also, gender images and after the war, 2008, between Georgia and Russia, the backlash of gender images and the understanding of gender roles was mentioned as one important obstacle. So to go back to traditional roles of understanding the male part as the defender and the women's part as the one who keeps the family going and who is the victim and who needs to be protected or defended. So the lessons learned very much go into the direction, on the one side, that gender images have to be taken into consideration, and the power structures differ. And when it comes to international cooperation, of course, also there we have to deal with these different images and with the mutual understanding of what are we talking about. So language-wise and from the concepts, it's important to become aware of that and to contextualize also all issues of dialogue elements into the specific situations, and differentiation of that in a sensitive manner is important. Strategic-wise, preparation of people and talking about gender issues and conflict issues in an open and trustful manner is one of the important issues that were identified on all levels, and those styles of work need, as everywhere and always, long-term interventions to overcome violence and trauma and to overcome this silence. Work on historical memories was mentioned at various times in the discussion. How to do that, and in what way to deal with this victimization also, and to heal the wounds and let the people find how to move forward. That is one of the challenges that this work brings. Another issue is to take up the peace activists which are there in the region, but at the moment lacking the support from the grassroots level. So that is strategically an important way to also create to create a link in the society between the existing peace activists and the grassroots level, to create a bottom-up approach for peace dialogue. The question how far political decision makers are already involved, and how far also the political processes that are ongoing and that are at the moment really on the in a very far-reaching manner, followed up by other actors which are far away from the grassroots level. That is one of the big challenges, and we didn't discuss that enough to really come up with recommendations there. But one important issue was mentioned, that the issue of displacement and the issue of return is one of the crucial elements in the South Caucasus region, and that needs to be taken up whenever it comes to further discussions, also with regard to gender aspects in these problems, and to peace negotiations and political strategies. Yeah, mainly adoption to the realities, and to really work with gender roles and traumatization. That is one of the major issues that needs further input. It is a problem of the generations in the Caucasus region as well. So one strategic element was highlighted to work with youth and to open spaces for youth groups to involve them in programs where gender issues and peace issues are dealt with regard to preparation of youth leaders, and to create also spaces for international networking and dialogue or exchange, for instance, between Balkan region and the Caucasus region, but also international. One could also link that with other conflictive areas to create an international experience. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You have very much highlighted the complexity when talking about a region and very different conflicts within this region, and not only talking about one particular country. You've also mentioned the transition of a regime and the changing of gender roles within this transition and the potential backlash of gender roles, which I think really refers to, in a different way, of course, but conceptually in what happens also in Afghanistan, where you have like a regime change, and gender roles are very much connected to this cultural changes, or like what regimes mean and how they translate into gender dynamics. Looking forward, you have mentioned the collaboration between different organizations through networks, and how important exchange is when looking at different groups of population and when looking at gender issues. At the same time, you mentioned how important it is to have a bottom-up approach and not an approach that comes from above and puts something above the population. Another issue you mentioned now at the end was the displacement and return that often is very highly gendered, referring to women's access to property, or how if them, like in a different context, it's an issue if the man is not there anymore and we have female single heads of household, what happens to property, and especially when it comes to displacement and return, it is a very complex issue in itself, but also gendered. Now look forward to the presentation of Amabara Abu Arah, and she will talk about the workshop that was about Iraq.
Thank you.
Would you like a PowerPoint presentation, or you?
It's like the other cases.
Okay, perfect.
In our group, we found ourselves looking at a country that only 7 years ago was completely dismantled. The whole system of economic, political, and cultural relations was completely abolished. So let me present these obstacles as presuming a starting point zero dating 2003, which started with the American occupation of Iraq, and the following consequences. We say this because following these huge, tremendous external shocks that Iraq has suffered, certain obstacles we find to be systemic within the current structures of Iraq, a state that is not yet built. We cannot assume a functioning, existing, complete state. It's a state in transformation, a nascent state. Therefore, I would like to start with the one major obstacle that still dominates gender discourse in general, supporting women's rights, and also the implementation of 1325, which has to do with the intervention of the UN and the funding the UN has given to Iraq, which was amounting to millions of dollars, and was eventually perceived by many local actors as enforcing a foreign agenda to a local context. Therefore, until now, and because of this huge funding with a lot of announcements of it, caused the local perception of perceiving women's rights more as a topic of the West rather than something that grew out of the local Iraqi context. This resistance is still remaining until today, and it's very difficult to overcome in many situations. Once the government was dissolved, there was an interim governing council headed by Bremer, an American general. This general put efforts into abolishing existing Iraqi laws that were protecting women's rights and which were considered on the Arabic regional level as huge achievements since the 1950s. His propositions included the abandonment of personal status law, a unified one, to the benefit of a sectarian divide of about 18 different personal status laws. So basically, this I'm giving you this example because with the new power, with the vacuum of power, with the vacuum of government, there was no government, the whole power relations have shifted and have changed. There was now a power struggle. So groups that during the previous regime did not have as much power gained on power and importance. And in these aspects, I would like to mention the Islamist movements and also tribal chieftains. So a cultural aspect has come to dominate also the discourse and the work on women's rights, gender, and also the implementation of 1325. Generally also, what came with this vacuum was that the whole different, first of all, there was lip service being made, because the whole argument of invading Iraq was also made on providing liberties and liberating women, etc. So there was a lot of support for women's organizations. However, in the course of the struggle, the political discourse has changed. Instead of now promoting or basing the image of a government on promoting women's rights and protecting them, the discourse has now shifted to something that is more about establishing the rule of law. Establishing the rule of law means that there is a different focus on political work. There are political bargains being made with different political actors. The shift from the focus on women's rights also means less funding, means less support within existing government institutions to issues of women's rights and including even women in the new power structures. On this, we also find that because of these new political bargains, resolving to alternative settlements on political power distribution include also more traditional alternatives. And these traditional alternatives are not always to the benefit, or are mostly not to the benefit of women and their inclusion in social and political processes in general. In addition to that, there is a problem that the existing regime, which it's not the point of discussion what one's own opinion is on the political regime of Saddam Hussein, but however, after this regime fell, the people who came after it to power made a point out of it to make sure that they were not identified with the previous regime, so they begged to differ. In this difference, they also made clear that they had nothing really to do with the West. The discourse or the notions of international standards on rights, which seem to be, which we assume are to be perceived as universal, lost credibility. Well, in addition, one has to remember that Iraq is, since the early 80s, in a continuous state of war, embargo, destitution, poverty, desperation, lack of services. So in general, the whole perception of masculinities have changed. And I say masculinities not only as a product of a culture of war, because this includes now several generations that have suffered from these new perceptions. The masculinities as perceived are not only accepted and implemented by men, but even women promote these masculinities. They have become the norm in thinking and considering one's own society. So even then, the question is, even though Iraq is the only country in the Arabic region that after the fall of the regime has managed, through the activism of women's organizations, to implement a 25% women quota on the parliamentary level within the constitution and is working on expanding this, yet once women reach to positions of power, because of the nature of the electoral system, because of the way people are being, how people access these positions, regardless of men or women, the main question is, once women get to positions of power, what is it that makes them different from their male colleagues in such positions? And this is something that is a major obstacle and that has not been analyzed well enough for Iraq yet. Although studies on this are being conducted by the partner organizations that Heinrich-Böll is working with in Iraq. I want to also mention that in the creation, that another obstacle is, for example, that there was no active civil society in Iraq, generally speaking, before 1991, and that civil society was could be found in Kurdistan of Iraq. After 2003, because of the huge funding that I mentioned at the beginning, huge numbers of NGOs emerged. There was a lot of trial and error for foreign donors, a lot of money spent in inefficient ways, and even on organizations that turned out not to be organizations that they claimed to be. So what happened for donors to make their work more efficient and assure that the huge funds that they were expected to spend are really being being spent, they created also some sorts of artificial networks. So networks between organizations that lacked in capacity, that lacked in coordination, that lacked in many aspects, suddenly were forced to network and exist together and coexist, while at the same time the fact that all of them were competing for the same funds was totally neglected. So in that sense, on the regional discourse on these issues, this falls under the category of corruption. And corruption is not only corruption in the way that funding is spread, distributed, selection criteria, etc., but corruption is existent. It's actually endemic in Iraq. In 2007, I think on an international level, Iraq was considered the second, if not the first, most corrupt country in the world. So this, of course, corruption does not just mean corruption in monetary terms, but also corruption in how decision-making processes are governed. And this is a major issue. So basically, our obstacles, as you can see, have a lot of a soft component. I mean, it's very difficult to measure them. It's very difficult to assess them. It's very difficult also maybe to try to work on them. They seem huge and they seem ambitious. But this is what we find, and I think we can justify this very broad and very kind of abstract presentation of obstacles legitimized if one takes into consideration the current political context of Iraq and where it is right now in being a state, being treated as a state when it yet is not a real state as one would like to see it and cannot help its citizens and protect it. So, but basically we also have some happy news, and we try to come up with some really positive ideas on what needs to be done. However, they fall in the same line. We found, for example, that how our media is today and how politics and wars are presented in media is so sensational that after the wars and the atrocities and the killings and the years of 2006, 2008, when the UN was reporting that around 50,000 Iraqi persons were fleeing every day, with 2 million Iraqis leaving their country until today, with whole minority communities gone forever, left and never to come back to the cultural context that they used to survive in. So we find that Iraq is not put enough on the political agenda, and it is not put enough out there in the media, and that the presentation of Iraq in the media is too positive, saying that there is so much improvement just to pay lip service to a government that gets international support. So we find that there needs to be done something with regard to the media. We also find that while the discourse in Iraq works on rule of law, that there needs to be an emphasis that it's not just rule of law, because as we all know, there are countries with great laws but no implementation. So there has to be an emphasis on rule of law and rights. And on this, we want to emphasize the need to building a civil state and not a religious state, as is propagated inside Iraq, for example. We want to build, or this is what our Iraqi colleague works on. This is not my personal opinion as someone representing the HBS. This is the voice from Iraq. The interest is in building a secular state, not a religious state. In this regard, what is being done and what needs to be supported, and here comes in also the role of international donors, is to really focus more on spending money on where it is really needed and on supporting capacity that is maintained. To give you an example, the most standard ever project proposal that you would find during the first years after the Iraq invasion was capacity building, training courses. And then the people would be sent back to their country. And then 2 years later, instead of using those people that one trained, one would go back to hire foreign trainers. So in this sense, I mean, what do you benefit? And this is just a very simple example. It's the most standard example for Iraq, but you can find it in many other examples too. So in this sense, there needs to be more logical thinking, more studying before spending the money in Iraq. So this is a call from the Iraqi activists to the donor society. On a more local level, it is perceived that activism should not be maintained to grassroots and onto the street, which is very important, but also to to include activists in specialized committees of different governmental bodies, and that there needs to be and today the notion of partnership is a rather random notion of partnership that has often to do with splitting money and not with really working together on issues. So partnerships needs to be strengthened, and there's also the call, like all my colleagues said before, for regional networking and to focus more on promoting natural synergies, natural networks that emerge within Iraq. And there's a last important issue that is neglected. It sounds very banal, but it is quite important. About 53% of the 50% of the Iraqi society is very young, around the age of 18 years old. But funding does not, or only rarely goes into supporting young men and women. So no wonder if there is no work done on masculinities among also young men, that nothing will change no matter how much money will be spent. So this is it from Iraq, and thank you.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive summary of the discussions. You're saying a lot about vacuum of the government and the big gap between international agenda or and the local needs, and then that the impression can be made that there's something external is put pressured on the population, especially when it comes to providing funding and conditioning funding. As well, you said, and you talked about the necessity to end at the same time at the conflict to include the local needs and population, at the same time not shifting into traditional pattern that may be damaging to gender equality, if I understand you correctly. You have to correct me at any time. Then you also asked a very critical question, taking a positive example of Iraq from the 25% women quota. And you asked that it's not only a matter about numbers, or you pointed out to us that it's not a matter of numbers, but also of quality, like who is represented and which women do we want to see in decision-making positions. I think one of the major issues you have highlighted in your presentation that referred to the local context and the balance between donors' priorities, or the priorities of a country that intervenes into the national structures, and on the other side the balance to local needs and what the population really needs, that there's a big gap and that we have to balance this gap out, and between the donating priorities and the local issues that emerged. I think that's a lesson learned from all the other country contexts as well, and I think it is a great opportunity to lead now maybe into a short discussion. I don't know how much time we have at this point, if we can get some questions from the audience, or if not, or if we one or two. Okay, so if there are one or two questions that can be asked to any of the working group presenters, or if you feel that in your working group there was some emerging issues that haven't been raised, I would like to ask you to come forward. So I feel everybody is quite happy with the presentation. I hope that's the interpretation you want me to receive. So if there are not any questions, then maybe we can go on and discuss the questions you may have to the representatives later on. So thank you very much.